so helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, dude.
So,
It's
so, yeah, I'm a bit nervous.
yeah, it's interesting. I could tell you usually are used to being on the other side. So I get
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah.
Just make
Um,
just make some jokes and it's fine.
yeah,
I'm it's usually I get to I don't know, usually it's like actually easy because it's like it's literally just asking questions and I mean, I like to talk, so
yeah.
hopefully I don't say something stupid.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about I was going to ask you actually some questions about your podcast,
Oh yeah.
because obviously this is episode 1, and I read on your website it's on episode 277, and
Yeah.
you've had 196 unique guests. So we might even just start the podcast there. So yeah, I was going to ask you a little bit about the podcast, and then we'll talk a little bit about obviously your training and your new course and stuff like that as we go along.
Oh,
So
that'd be awesome.
if you're happy, the podcast stuff is going to be a selfish one for me, so I can learn from the master as we go along.
I wouldn't say I'm the master. I just be curious. That's it.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
literally it.
yeah. So for anyone who is listening, if there is anyone listening, so we have Joel Smith on today. We don't have a name for the podcast yet, but we have Joel Smith from Just Fly Sports. He doesn't need much of an introduction, but the reason I wanted to bring Joel on for my first podcast was because my first podcast that I appeared on was your podcast, Joel, which really threw me into the deep end. So if people can hear my voice today, which is like the little bit of quiver in my voice in the beginning, I actually rarely get nervous, but I am a little bit nervous today. And I was definitely nervous doing that podcast that first time with you, because you obviously have a lot of big names and stuff on. And then it was just me talking crap about feet and knees and stuff like that. So you're very welcome. Thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, David. It's I've never been guest number one, so this is like
Right.
a huge honor. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we were hoping to. So I'm committing to doing 20 episodes at least, and then seeing like if I'm any good at it, if I enjoy it, if anyone is listening, and then take it from there. So to get to 277 is pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I occasionally hear people say like, all right, well, I'll get to this number and then we'll see. And they always keep going. So
Yeah,
I'm sure someday you'll be up to 277 or more. So
yeah,
yeah,
man.
it's
What's your biggest, like, if you had one big piece of advice for me to get to there? Now it's obviously like in anything, it's not just about like getting to a certain number or whatever. It's about quality. Like, so is there a big thing that you would say, don't make the mistake I did, or here's how you keep going, or whatever?
That's a good question. It's interesting to think about. I guess maybe the only mistake is that I live by the seat of my pants a lot, and the sense of like for a long time it was literally. I mean, the show was supposed to go out Thursday, and I'm interviewing a guest on Tuesday or something. And I think the biggest thing is just this is for me personally is just stay a few weeks ahead, and that because ultimately I look at, well, what makes a successful podcast? In my opinion, it's just a pure curiosity is one, transparency and authenticity, and being ahead of time, like just being a little bit ahead allows you to do that more.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to get caught in a situation, in my opinion, where it's like, well, I got to put a show out, and just to be able to stay true to yourself optimally, I think that just staying a little bit ahead has helped me. I'm still not as far as I'd like, to be honest. I've gone from probably 2 days ahead to maybe on average 1 to 2 weeks ahead. So I call that, for me, that is growth.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That's
just
a
being
that's a
able.
that's a big win, because I'm like you in that regard. I'm like last minute for everything. I'm just a procrastinator with everything. So especially when I'm even courses and stuff. I know you have a new course, but like the only way I can actually get work done is by setting a deadline and saying, right, it's going to be out on this date, and then I start to work. I can't, which puts me under pressure, but that pressure is what makes me work, rather than if I don't have that pressure, I'll just keep ignoring
Yeah, that pressure is a key to life, though. It's the
it.
same. I and even for the course I just released. I mean, that deadline got pushed back so many times. It's kind of like a deadly combination because I'm a bit of a perfectionist with certain things. Some things not at all. Like doing the dishes, my wife gets mad at me all the time for missing spots. But when it comes to like something that's like a book, a course, I'm just like I have this obsessiveness about it. that probably borders on the unhealthy, but I think I've been able to put together some decent things. But that, yeah, so it's like, but then you're a little bit of a procrastinator, and that, and yeah, just setting realistic expectations has been a really big journey on my own end. But here we are.
The phrase like how you do one thing is how you do everything. I don't think that's true at all.
Yeah, I think in some things it is.
Some things it is, but you see a lot of successful people in one part of their life who are just complete mess in another part. Athletes in particular.
Yeah. My first main boss, when I was coaching track at a place called Wilmington College, it was just a little NCAA Division III school. And this is when I was very admittedly unprepared for life. I'd gone through the education system, had 6 years of college, and this, you could probably detect some of my viewpoints in me saying this, but I jump into my first job and it's a lot of organization and recruiting and all these things that take, my strengths are very much curiosity. I'm a little ADHD, a little bit, and very like, seat of the pants ideas. And then this job requires very like fixed, organize a recruiting notebook, be proactive in calling, be a year ahead of sending letters out and all this stuff. And I'm like, this is the opposite of me. And then I remember very distinctly my boss telling me one day, he looked at my workouts on the board. And he's like, wow, this is like the only thing you're organized in. Like, you're like, if you were like this in everything, that'd be awesome. So I definitely, and I don't know why I remember that. It's just kind of funny. Maybe it was just something that was very important for me at that time in my life. But I've tried to take that mentality and like organizing my workspace very thoroughly, and just it's like little 1% every year. Mm-hmm. So I'm getting.
I bet you it sounds like then you've almost flipped in some ways, where your work stuff has become more structured and now your training has become less structured from listening to you over the last couple of years.
That's hilarious. That's actually 100% true. I just literally did a podcast that'll go out in a couple of weeks with Austin Yoakum, talking about that line between order and chaos. Mm-hmm. And how, I mean, my fascination is you're so right, is I used to be much more structured, and I still am in many ways if I'm writing programs for online clients and things like that. But even in that context, I'll oftentimes have 2 warm-ups, you pick, or I'm trying to build in more and more options to allow their own intuition to be a part of that process. And that's really important. Yeah. Much more than I would have thought 10 years ago. I used to just think, well, what's the best program you can write to hit the biggest part of the bell curve? And, and then you can make a book about it and whatever. And it's not that way. It's like this, it is this spectrum of order and chaos that allows you to, yes, have a structure that is the masculine, the yang, there must be a frame to the house. But then once you have that frame, allowing the flow to happen is the magic that I think we don't like. The field is very good at structure. There's all sorts of certifications and organizations and saying how do you do this, but there's a lot less talk about how do we allow that athlete's intuition to come out and really connect with the session.
Yeah. And that's how they learn too, right? Is like actually having to think and say, does that exercise feel better for me, or does that one feel better for me? And like, I struggle with that definitely, because I fall more on movement side of things. I definitely fall more on the chaos side when I'm working with people. Now I'm quite structured in some ways, but when they get to a certain point, I need to start to influence and bring in more of the chaos side of things. And it's not even chaos. It's just making them aware of their own body and making them make their own choices and things like that. I think that's how people learn. And it's very tough in the rehab side of things. And I think because the risk is there, right? The risk is there's more risk involved with that than being like, here's the exact thing that you should be doing. But they don't learn that way at all.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. Yeah, rehab being more I think a lot too about, I don't know, maybe we can talk about this, but I was just thinking the other day of how important it is for athletes to occasionally, I mean, hopefully they don't, right? But when they do get hurt, that draws in such a different part of the psyche and the approach to the movement versus your typical training. You kind of take for granted you're healthy. But so oftentimes athletes will have an injury, they're overtraining, they're doing whatever, they get hurt, and then they actually rebound off that into like a personal best. And I was thinking about how do we take these pieces of rehab that are so valuable there, where we have to go internal and we have to go back to the basics, and then we can take it out into, that more chaotic and open environment. And then I also was thinking about, and I'd be curious, we can talk about this too, but like the idea of, I've been really into like the Edith Weiss, like Mark Marinovich, Probot X, like the discs and the water bags, and not so much from like the all the fancy exercises you can do with the water bag, but more just the idea of it's a little more chaotic. You know what I'm saying? And even that in the rehab things.
And with that, like, so the perturbation that you get from balance training or something like that, I've seen you, I wanted to ask you about that later on with some of the discs that you balance on and stuff like that. The order and chaos thing is interesting because I think the more chaotic the environment, the more simple the body actually has to become. And Franz Bosch talks about that, where that's why the co-contractions are there in our bodies to try and make things very simple. For instance, if you're walking on ice, if you see someone walking on ice, like their body has to, they'll walk with like flexed knees and they'll take shorter steps and all of these things because the environment has become more chaotic. So the body has to become much more simple. And that's an interesting thing to think about. That's why sometimes I think, some people talk about functional exercises when they're doing balance stuff and stuff like that. It's more functional. And they think that maybe sometimes I'm promoting movement. Maybe sometimes you're actually promoting movement or not promoting movement in that regard, because you're actually forcing the body to stabilize much more and become much more simple body. So it is an interesting thing to think about that. Like, and then sometimes you can have a more movement, which might mean more chaos, by putting your hands on something to balance as you do a split squat, a half field split squat or something like that. You get the balance in your body, so then your body can move through more range of motion, which you might call more chaos. I don't know. So that's just a bit of I'm going to try and avoid them soliloquies as I go along. That's not what I intended to do, but it's just an interesting concept.
You're totally right. I was there's one exercise it's out of the Probot X book where you have again, it's funny because sometimes I'm like, you have that archetype of like the circus, in the gym, like where you're doing too many things. And maybe that's the way how you just described it is a way to say this isn't a circus, because in the sense of there's some people on Instagram, they're doing exercises and there's a million things going on. And I do think a level of complexity, and I talk about this in the course, is making the body work at high velocity to coordinate is really important. But when there's too many degrees of freedom, and it's like, well, what's really happening? And there was an exercise in the Probot X I was doing where the front foot is on a disc with like a little hard point knob on the bottom. So your foot has all these degrees of freedom in the circular plane. The back leg is on a physio ball and you're doing a split squat there. And that's a very, I don't know, like a lot of people say, well, that's just a circus kind of thing. Like, but as you were saying, as I've been doing that, there's kind of only one way to do that and not fall off. If that makes sense. Like there's only one plane for the most part. There's probably a few different, but there's one plane the body likes to stay in, a track the body likes to stay in to actually do that split squat and not fall. And so I in you saying that's the first time I've thought about it in that perspective. I've always liked the idea that having the discs or the balance, it does let the body pick more so than being locked in like a squat with the feet flat and fixed. But in the body will pick and kind of stick with that efficient track. That's a really cool way of thinking about it.
Yeah. It has to be really simple at that stage. You can't mess around. So it forces those co-contractions to happen. It has no choice, which that could be a really valuable thing for someone. And like I've definitely to and froed on that stuff over the years. Like, is it worthwhile? Is it not worthwhile? But it's hard to intellectualize it. But I think athletes just feel good when they use, or people just feel good. And I can't explain why they feel good all of the time, but they feel good when they use some of that stuff. And we can't quantify like, oh, would I have prevented injuries here if I use more of that stuff? It's impossible to say, but like just giving people a challenge. And I think I heard John Kiley, who you've interviewed, I think in the past, say, when you can give an athlete a task where they're concentrating on something, but they couldn't tell you what they're concentrating on. So they couldn't say, I'm focusing on my foot or my knee or my hip here. It's I'm focused. I can't have a conversation with you very easily while I'm doing the task, but I am concentrating on something. And I think that's a nice line to push someone towards. And I think that's a body that has to learn quickly then. And that's someone that just has to pay attention, because you can do a squat without paying any attention to what your body is doing.
Yeah. Same thing with so many rehab, like TheraBand stuff. And I mean, you could just totally go through the motions. It would be interesting if you wanted to quantify, like if you could quantify brain activity with different, like do a balance disc, now do just a clamshell. What's the difference in the engagement and how the brain is learning?
Yeah, exactly, man. Exactly. And just, I was actually going to ask you about this later on, but I suppose we may as well, while we're talking about kind of structured versus unstructured, with regards to, so we teamed up with a young athlete a couple of years ago for a few months, at least I was working with him. I don't know how long you were working with him, but I won't say his name. But one of the cool things that I saw when you were programming him at the time, his training was unbelievably structured. So he was in an academy, soccer, football academy, a very good academy, and he was super structured with his own training and with their training. And you changed some of his plyometric work. So for instance, on his structure, like it was like, okay, I'm in with the club from this time to this time. I come home, I have dinner at this time, then I stretch for half an hour at this time, then I do this amount of plyometrics, then I do my ball handling work and all of this stuff. And I think you changed a lot of his training to like, right, here's some basic strength exercises. And the very cool thing I thought you had him doing was dunking a tennis ball. And it wasn't quantified as much, like you have to dunk it X amount of times, or it was almost like, I can't remember exactly, but like 20 or 30 minutes of just playing around dunking a tennis ball in different ways, left foot, right foot jumps, all different things. And I just thought that was like such a cool way, especially for a young athlete, to get his reps in a real non-structured way.
Oh yeah. When him and I first started working together, and I remember you being involved as well. I remember looking at the program, and it was just that. It was so hyper structured, and even seeing what some of the strength coaches were utilizing at the time. He was doing like box jumps with weighted vests, and I'm just like, this kid needs to play. I mean, play changes everything. I've had a number of guests on my podcast. One of the most recent was Daniel Bach, strength coach out of Austin, Texas. And he was saying when he was just trying to jump higher, and this guy's a soccer player, like, vertical jump and dunking is not his primary objective. Although at younger ages, I think it's important to be able to utilize multiple skills and things like that. Even a professional soccer player, just for fun in the off season or occasionally, it would be really cool. But Daniel had talked about basically the thing that helped him improve his jump was, and I'm sure there was tons of global adaptations too, was just getting stronger and doing fun dunks on a low rim. All sorts of, you're playing. It's not just like the rim's 10 feet and you're just trying to do this thing. And so, like we had multiple jumps in there. A lot of times I would write like a basketball quote unquote workout, but it would just say, all right, for 5-10 minutes, practice like a reverse layup. For 5-10 minutes, practice this kind of thing, or just have fun. Eventually just became just have fun for this amount of time. And that was so powerful for him. And I mean, it's crazy how quickly, like soccer, especially higher level soccer athletes, are really driven to a level of specialization really fast. But just to keep play and to keep other sports in is so important for any athlete.
Yeah. And do you think like he benefits from that? One, just from it not being structured, and two, it's like, right, the system has a task here. Like the fun part of it is obviously a big part, but the system has a task which it has to focus on. It's not just like you jump as high as you can for X amount of reps. It's actually like there's an end goal, and the end goal is dunk the tennis ball here. And now your body has to organize around that. Is that your thought process there? Like, so the task doesn't necessarily matter. It's just that there is a task, an end goal, and you have to think about that rather than just measuring yourself all the time on how high I can actually jump.
Yeah, absolutely. Just having a task and watching the body figure it out. So oftentimes, I was at Rafe Kelly, who's been on my podcast a couple of times. He had a human movement retreat called Return to the Source, and we were talking about coaching one day and cueing. And there's research that shows that it was something as to the tune of feedback was given every rep out of 10, like for whatever they were doing, like maybe sprinting or whatever it was. And then there was another one where feedback was every other attempt. And then there was one where like only 1 out of every 10 things was you gave feedback. So you do it 10 times, and then the coach said something 1 time. And the most effective thing was where the coach said something only 1 time out of 10. It just shows how powerful learning machines we are. We do too much as coaches so often. And so just to be able to give an athlete something to do and try and learn, you see the body figuring it out. And that's the beautiful thing where it's like, look, I'm not telling you anything. Like, I'm just watching. And so, but then the thing is, well, when do we coach more? It's when we see the same mistake being repeated over and over and over again. And then we try to go in. But one of the things I like about dunking is there's certain things that just have cultural significance. I don't know if you call movement archetypes, but things that like a kid growing up, it's like, I want to do this. And I want to dunk there's something that's just more than just a skill. Like if I said, hey, go jump on that rock. Okay, cool. Like I'll go jump on that rock. But there's something that's more electric to like, yeah, I dunked it. It just is a feeling that flows through your body. It energizes you. You could say it releases more dopamine or whatever. I don't know. It's fun. And there's something that's really meaningful in there. So I like the idea of dunking things. I don't know how that would go in an ancestral, play or whatever. It's probably more of a modern thing to have a rim and a hoop and, whatever. But I think that's no matter what sport you play, I think the ability to dunk something is powerful.
Yeah, I think one of the things in Ireland is obviously we don't have much basketball, and we have Irish sports like Gaelic football and hurling, but they're played on a big pitch, a big field, and it's hard to do much on your own. Like it's very hard, or with two people, like, yeah, you could go up and hit the ball 100 yards to each other and stuff like that. But one of the things I'm really jealous of kind of on the basketball, especially, I've learned this from just working with people and talking with people from the States over the years, is like you can just go out and shoot and jump around and stuff, and you can do that for as many years as you want. You can do that, like you can do that until you're 60, 70 years of age. And I think that's so cool that you just need literally a rim and a ball, and you can make your own workout and stuff like that. And Irish sports definitely struggle with that. Even with soccer, I think it's good because you can get on a 2 versus 2 pitch or something like that. But in our sports, we don't have that. So people, when they retire from competitive sport, that sport is pretty much gone for them. They don't do it anymore. And you see Irish athletes get old and slow and pretty miserable looking very, very quickly once they retire, because there's no accessibility left for them. So that's one of the things with especially with basketball, I think is really cool.
I think it'd be funny to have some sort of like score associated with people post sport, like 25 and up. What are you doing? Are you enjoying it? You know, like some sort of movement well-being beyond age 25 scored by countries. Frank Frenchich, who was he's like kind of like an anthropologist, likes to study like the ancestral movement, what's the core of who we are as humans. And when he was on my podcast, actually the last episode, he was talking very favorably about basketball, because not only is it, like you said, it can be very individual, there's creative, like you can practice moves, but there's also a rhythm. Every time that ball bounces, it's rhythmic. And I think there's something that tunes the body. It's just like, there's something about a bouncing ball that's really cool, and being able to tune that up with your body as well.
Yeah, the noise of that. Yeah, big time. With your new course, Elastic Essentials, is that right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I have it. I haven't dived too deep into it yet, but I'm looking forward to it. But when you say elasticity, Joel, or when you talk about elasticity, or when you might say that's an athlete who is an elastic athlete, what does that mean? What comes to mind for you when you talk about someone in that way?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll just prelude that to saying that course, when I started strength and conditioning, when I was 21, I had my first experience as a strength and conditioning intern. And honestly, I really had a poor experience. Like, I didn't want to be a strength coach after doing that, because all it seemed to be was, here's some lifts, yell a lot at the athletes, do it this way. And there was really no respect paid, as I saw, to athleticism. And I don't think I could describe it at the time, but what makes someone athletic? What makes someone reactive? What gives someone just bounce and speed? And so as I progressed through, I eventually did fall back into strength and conditioning. And in my 8 years as a full-time strength coach, I started with a very mechanistic model. Like, you're going to go in, you're going to do your typical movement prep. We're going to basically lift dumbbells and barbells the whole time. And as I moved through, I started really taking the barbells and dumbbells slowly out. They were still in there at the end, but they ended up in a much smaller proportion. And I was filling that space with a lot of body weight stuff, primal human skills, games, body weight isometric holds, things that were much more, I feel like you play with your body weight. So let's optimize this thing. And so long story short, I would consider the elastic athlete to be a master of storing and returning elastic energy. Mm-hmm. And that starts with the foot, the ability, if you're a land athlete, probably not if you're a swimmer as much, but if you're a land athlete, it starts with your ability to interact with the ground, to store and release energy. There's the pronation and internal rotation elements, but then also that goes beyond to how do I work with my own body weight? So oftentimes we see athletes, and we're like, glorify this, is someone posts themselves lifting, and the first thing you see is their face tense up and just all these excess contractions happening all over the place, falling into this, like glorifying this like concentric oriented, rigid approach. So we're like we ignore the feet, and then we ignore the ability of the body weight to work fluidly. And so basically it's just prioritizing how we store and release elastic energy, prioritizing how we approach body weight. And then when we do utilize barbell training means, how do we not overcoach those to the point where we're locking athletes out of, the ability to internally rotate and to actually go through that release pattern of energy. So just storing and releasing, being a master storer and releaser of energy is one way you could put it.
Yeah. On the neck and jaw stuff, when I first work with a whoever, let's say they have back pain or like hip tightness or whatever the hell it is, I can't ignore the neck and the jaw and like that tensioning up above. I pretty much have accepted that I'm going to have to clean that up with anyone who's been heavily into the gym for a number of years. That like, I just ask them to posterior tilt their pelvis in the smallest way and they clench their jaw every time. And it's just like, I'm just using the most high threshold strategy I can find to do every single movement. And that's a very expensive strategy to be using on your body. And it is good. Like if I can tense every single thing in my body to lift the weight and stuff like that. But when I don't have an external load on me, apart from gravity, obviously, like, do I need that all of the time? And I want to be able to go up through the gears. There is like in motor output, there is like, let's say a 0 to 10 in that regard, but do I want to go from 0 to 10 all the time, or do I want to be able to hit a 6 or a 7 without having to go full on clench every single thing in my body? So that's an interesting thing. Do you think, I've heard you probably say before, and I don't know if you still subscribe to this, but like, would that be the same thing as then describing someone maybe as like a muscular versus a tendon-driven athlete or a fascial-driven athlete? Is that kind of the same thing, or would you still use those type of words?
Yeah, that's a good question, how I still use that. So I would say somewhat. Like it's not the core. I've actually moved towards the core of the muscle versus fascial-driven to my understanding of a wide and narrow infrasternal angle. Actually, I feel like that's like whatever we would say is muscular or elastic, I really think can go down to that infrasternal angle. Mm-hmm. And then everything else is kind of a flavor of it. Like, for example, I'm a narrow infrasternal angle. I'm elastic. I am that archetype to a T. However, like what you were saying, with like, I put a lot more muscular flavor on that than I should have. And a real big moment that hit me, that I had become so much more muscular in nature versus my old, like maybe 17, 18-year-old Joel playing basketball, just getting up and dunking, like no warm up, just going up and bouncing off one leg and dunking like no problem. I was doing a depth jump in some photo sequences for my book, Speed Strength. And so I was like, I don't know, I was like 34 at the time. And I looked at my face and neck when I was doing that depth jump. And I couldn't tell you 100% that I didn't do this when I was younger, but I would say I probably didn't. But like all the muscles of my face and neck were just like striated out in reversing this depth jump. And I'm just like, I don't think it's supposed to be like this. And I could see that happening over time. Just think about holding a barbell, think about holding a bar for a back squat, think even a front squat where there's compression, right? Like you're in that, Pat Davidson calls it the zone 2, where the elbows are straight ahead and you're still compressing the upper body. And I mean, that's not to say that a level of jaw, like there are certain muscles that definitely need to be on. One of the lessons I learned from Adarian Barr was talking about, we had a day, I think he called like turtling your neck or something, but even this, it's hard to describe, but basically it's like, imagine you're sprinting, and everyone listening to this, go out and try it when you run, but like, just imagine your whole head subtly, maybe 1 centimeter, just kind of like compressing down towards your collarbones, not like chin down, but just everything vertical straight down, just this very subtle compression. And you actually, I've felt it really helped you actually to run a little faster, because you do need some, if you're sprinting, if you're doing something explosive, there needs to be compression in the system.
Yep.
But then there's also excess where everything is just turned on. And I'll leave it with saying this is one thing I want to get into now that the course is done, I can relax a little bit, is I spent some time learning the Alexander technique, if you've heard of that.
Yeah.
And I there's a really good practitioner in my area. And so I'm going to make it a point to visit her every week, because our emotions are also coming up in that. You see it, like I was coaching, volunteering just 1 day a week with high school track last year, working with a lot of like high jumpers in particular. And in high jump, you see it, watch people's faces when they go to jump. And you can tell a lot about that person just by seeing the expression their face makes. And so many people look like they're in pain, like, oh, I have to try so hard to do this. Like, and it's like a validation thing, and so there's a lot of layers to that. I feel like the jaw is just, it's really interesting. Actually, I really want to do more research into that as I move forward.
Yeah, there's a lot to learn up there, the neck and jaw stuff, and just that upper body is huge. I think freeing up the upper body is like freeing up arm swing. Starting to see, definitely when I look at you moving, like you see a lot of arms everywhere, arms moving all over the place. And like when you see someone who just does not swing their arms when they walk or run, or like doesn't get much range of motion there, it's hard to look at anything else, and you can just presume they don't move very well, because like arm swing is rotation. It's what one arm is going forward, one arm is going back. If that doesn't happen, now obviously both could go back, both could go forward depending on the task, but when you don't see arm swing, you see a system that's locked up, and they have to clench instead and as well. But the compression thing, like compression, people think compression is a bad word. It's just another thing that our body needs to be able to do. It's just when we're stuck in one or the other. That's a big thing. But yeah, the tendon versus muscular thing is interesting to me, because I do struggle with that, thinking of things that way, because is what allows us to take advantage of our tendons is someone who is better at overcoming muscle slack at their muscles. So I think, so if someone's foot hits the floor and their muscles can contract quicker or get an isometric at the muscle quicker, then the tendon is going to stretch, and we're going to have to use that tendon in a different way, versus the muscular athlete then is going to have to lengthen the muscle more to overcome slack in the muscle, and then use the muscle more to push them off. So is that then like, okay, a coach is like, this is where you see S&C coaches with an unbelievable looking counter movement jump. They can jump through the roof because they have all this time to bend their knees all the way down and get down into that squat position. So I can use all my strength then to push me back out of it. But if you ask them to run and maybe hit the floor and change direction, then that's not going to happen. Is that a drawback of strength training then for some people who go that far down at that? Do you think about it that way, that they can't overcome muscle slack, and that's why they can't maybe use their tendons as well, and they have to use the muscle and really like lengthen muscle to be able to push off? Does that make sense? Is that something that you would think about?
Yeah, I think I know what you're asking there. And so that, yeah, like basically you, outside of the wide and narrow ISA, just another categorization being, well, your standing vert's awesome, but then once you go to running vert, you can't do it. And I think there's a lot of things that go into something like that. I do think, and this is another reason I've gone to more the ISA than even saying you're really tendon driven. I mean, and some athletes who have like really long Achilles, yeah, you could make the argument they're more tendon driven. They have a longer, bigger tendon that stores and stretch. There's a lot of, it's really complex. And the reason maybe I don't use those terms specifically so much anymore, it's funny, like I'm looking up, like I'm trying to search for like this concise answer, but name me an athlete, no matter how sloppy and how bad, who doesn't use their tendons, right? Like You have to. So I guess the question then is how it's almost really more, and yes, you can condition tendons. They can get stronger and connective tissue can get stronger and there's fascial integration. And I think that you can definitely leverage that more than others. But I think a lot of it is just how do you use joints? And for example, with the vertical jump type thing, there's many factors, but someone who can't take their vertical well into running things, you could say that they have a problem transitioning the foot to like an active class 2 lever mode where the heel can get off the ground early enough to allow the Achilles to store and release quickly. So that could be like one of it. Another thing is muscle driven, a good standing vert, but bad running could have really bad internal rotation. So if they're going to do a double leg jump, for example, maybe that lead leg has a hard time inward turning to stop their momentum. And that could go even all the way up the chain into what you were saying, like maybe they have no rib movement. Athletes, it's funny because this just hit me like a year ago, and it's probably mostly because of you, honestly, is athletes who have just really struggled to jump off the run, and especially two legs. And it's almost like the two leg running vertical, I feel like that's a more functional vertical in some ways than a single leg, because you have to have two legs doing two different jobs. You have to internally rotate the lead block leg, which you also then need up the chain, some upper body, some rib mobility. And I had one client in particular I was working with who just really was terrible he was a volleyball player and was really terrible at a running two leg jump. And I noticed he just really couldn't internally rotate that front leg. And then I started to think about it more. It's like, this guy's ribs are just as stuck as you could possibly imagine. He has no choice. Like we could do all the internal rotation drills in the world and nothing's going to change that much. There will be a level of change, but it will not continue until he can learn to unlock and unwind that upper body a little bit more. And so I think that it's just, there's a total, like, I guess you call like motility of the whole body that works together to really unlock this reactivity once you get beyond the standing vertical.
Yeah. And looking at like I think you're right there with looking at like the ISA, infrasternal angle, for anyone who's not listening, and or for anyone who isn't sure of that term. And I think looking at the joints like makes a big difference, because I was only saying the other day to someone, like, you can look at the muscle can trick you and you can't really tell what's going on here. You can't really tell what's going on with the tendon. But if someone just doesn't move the bone, if the bone or the joint isn't able to move, they don't have access to range of motion. Like you can actually tell something from that. You can infer something from that rather than making a guess around, is the muscle strong enough or weak enough, or is all of these other things that is really just a massive guess, or is it activating or not activating? Like, I'd rather say, does it get into the position? Does the joint get into the position where it loads the muscle in that way? And with that, like, that lack of internal rotation that you're saying, obviously the internal rotation is putting force into the ground, and internal rotation is of the front leg is also getting length into the glute max, and that glute max it's helping it overcome slack so that it can contract then, or it can move into a concentric position and push. So it's looking at the movement of the joints, obviously something Gary Ward talks about a lot. It's such an easier way of deciding. You can coach someone for the rest of your life to try and do something, but if their joint can't get there, they have no chance of doing it. So bones don't lie, I don't think.
Yeah, I think there is like a general, are you muscular or elastic? Yeah, the ISA, you can look at it there. But then to go into any specific skills, you do need to expand your tool set and say, okay, you can't do this. So what joint isn't moving like it's supposed to? And why isn't it doing that? And how can I help you get there a little bit more? Other than that, and I think about that a lot, though, in the sense of, this is where, again, we really have to respect the self-organization of athletes. A lot of athletes are really good compensators, and they found really good ways to work around these deficits. There's in the basketball or vertical jump world, there was a guy, Justin Darlington, and I spent a lot of time watching this guy. It's like a 6'4" pogo stick, like can touch the top of the backboard, and a 2-foot jumper. And I really wonder what his like structure is. Like, I've kind of spent some time guessing as to how he is, because when he takes off like a jump stop. Like, he doesn't plant and then internally rotate as much. He kind of just lands with his feet planted together and just does a kangaroo bounce. Yep. And so here's a guy who probably has some sort of maybe limitations and some like internal, maybe the ribs, I don't know, but has still found a way to get it done. And so that's and in working in the swimming world, you would see a lot of like spinal restrictions and stiffnesses, and I've spent some time working with a guy who won the 100 free in the 2012 Olympics, and his spine was super rigid, definite, pure wide ISA type person, and his approach or swim stroke was very asymmetrical, like da 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 da, and he's just working with what he has in this as athletic way as he can. And so I also just think it is interesting to watch athletes figure out ways to work around their structure. But the more we learn about this stuff, the more it's like, wow, that's so cool how you figured out how to, you don't really have good range here and you still figured out how to do this. That's pretty cool. Obviously, we still can help athletes the most by helping them to, the critical gaps, filling those in, especially if it's leading them to getting injured and things like that.
So with them type of athletes, then, like if it's someone like you, for instance, then do you think the strength training side of things, aside from like beginner gains for a couple of years and just making sure you're strong enough, whatever that means, do you think then that's as much about just getting rid of that inhibition that the nervous system might be holding, stopping you from producing that much force or whatever, just protecting your body, more so than just like tissue quality, whatever that, I don't really even like that word or term because I don't know what it means, but just strengthening the local tissue? Do you think it's more of a inhibition thing then, or de-inhibition?
So you're asking what is the beginner gains help? How does that
after the beginner gains. So
gotcha.
After the beginner gains, so we're going to keep strength training someone, probably no matter who they are. It's just how much you do and how you do it. But do you think, I need to get better at making my questions clear, don't I? But how much for a narrower person, or for someone like that someone might describe as tendon-driven, is okay, I'm going to keep strength training them to make sure the nervous system isn't inhibiting me, so it gets used to this amount of force and stuff like that, rather than actual like making the tissues locally stronger.
Yeah, so I got you. Dan John, when he was on my show, said something interesting, and it was like something to the tune of, does anyone know exactly why strength training makes someone better, why they throw farther? And I think we can throw a lot of things and I can throw a lot of things I think happen out there, but I don't know if I could tell you exactly why, just from the perspective of, okay, like let's say I'm a narrow ISA, I'm elastic, I'm bouncy, and there's a lot of people like me who barely lift, who do incredible athletic things. And so you say, well, why do you need to strength train? I would say, just if I had to rattle off a few things from the top of my head, I would say, yes, there is, like, in moving slower, you have a beneficial effect for the tendons, the muscle tendons, those, like a health related effect. And I think that's cool. You do have, if you don't compress at all, strength training does teach you to compress a little bit more. And I think there is a level of compression that it's nice to have, but obviously we don't want to get excessive. We don't want to get stuck in it. We don't want to change the shape of our body in a negative way. But it's also, it is a different way of creating a high neurological output. So, if I'm a jumper and all I do is just these quick, explosive, or I could do I could drop off a 4-foot box and create a high neurological output. It's just a different way of doing it, in a way that's probably more joint friendly. I will say, as I've gotten a little bit older as an athlete, and my nervous system can't handle the high intensity that I was pounding out in my early 20s. I mean, when I was jumping my best as a high jumper, I was pretty regularly, not often, but I hit my best track meet ever at 21 was 3 days after a really heavy 2/3 back squat for a triple. And that just potentiated my nervous system. It just fired up my nervous system. It's not like it created any other likely adaptations that were anything outside of that. So there was that level to it. But now, as I've gotten a little older, and my general disposition for narrows is actually to leave the strength training a little bit more higher reps. It's a little more general. It's usually designed in a way that minimizes compression, like the compressive ability of the upper body to lift. So I will likely give a safety bar. Like if we can do a safety bar squat, we'll do that, because then the arms are down. You can't lift the weight by compressing harder. I mean, a little bit, but the upper body factor is less of a thing that's helping you lift the weight. So, and then I'll leave the neural outputs to a little bit more of the plyometric-y stuff and the sprints and that kind of thing for a narrow. And then, you could play around with feeding in some of those lower rep potentiations. But I look at the athlete I was in high school, And I was a good athlete in high. I mean, if you want to look at pure function, pure elasticity, I wish I could dig up an old dunk video that I had in a dunk contest when I was 18. I remember it's on my friend's old like it's on a VHS somewhere. So this is literally 20 years ago. But I just remember watching how I got up off the ground. And it was like, as I was running up to the hoop, it looked like my heels barely hit the ground. And again, I know the heels are important, but just for the sake of this specific function, if I would have wanted to play defense, I could be flat footed. So I could do that. However, it was like my heels would barely touch, and then I would just explode off my forefoot, and just I kept going up. I was like, man, this is crazy. And in that time of my life, it was not a lot of, it was like sets of 10 step ups and occasional squats, but not a lot. And it was just a lot of basketball and a lot of like plyometric and a lot of sprinting, and I ran hurdles and track and all that stuff. So, I did just fine then without it, so it's just like, I feel like it's a tool you can use every now and then. Just don't get carried away with it for the heavier stuff.
Yeah. Is there anything, if you're getting someone into plyometrics or someone back into plyometrics, like pogos or anything like that, question I want to ask you is a more specific question now is, what's your thoughts on the people who are asking people to like pull their toes up in the air, dorsiflex before they hit the floor, versus not do that? I'm interested in your thoughts on that. I think I might know your answer, but I'm interested.
Yeah. I got some thoughts. So I just think as coaches, we want to feel like we're doing something. Like as Kibwe Johnson, who is an elite level hammer thrower, recently on my podcast talked about, like the coach will so often feel they need to insert themselves in the process that should be the athletes. And we need to be very mindful of this. And going back to even the 1 in 10 feedback, and it's like, we need to create the structure and let the athlete just figure as much out as they can. And so I just think that, well, first off, I'll say this, the ability to do a pogo and have your toes up and come down is important. Like a good athlete, in my opinion, should be able to do that. And I think that is why the coaches will coach that. It's the same thing with anything else I think we see in an athletic movement, in running. Like a good sprinter can choose to run with their knees higher if they want to, probably, but that doesn't mean that's the fastest way for them. In fact, it's probably a much lower shade of knee lift than what they're ultimately capable of. So we look at the fact that these good athletes are capable of these things, and then we just make that part of the coaching process. Everyone gets coached up this way. The problem is when we do that, I just think there's almost too many co-contractions. We're making it more mechanical. So my ideal is, if you, let's say, if I want you to get there, what I'd rather have you do first, that's a constraint where you're not overdoing it, is can you just do like pogo hops forward, like rudiment hops, like Dan Paff, I think, is a very, like, that goes back to at least him and probably other individuals, but can you just do pogos forward and use your whole foot? That's it. Because
so you're rolling through the full foot.
Yeah, exactly. Because that constraint in and of itself forces you to at least get your toes up, meeting the challenge the same way you organize to dunk it. I shouldn't have to tell you, do this. That's it. Like, I'm sitting here telling you everything to do. Like, what kind of ownership is that? And so that's my starting point. And I find actually athletes who have a hard time with that, they don't have a prayer of doing that, like the toes up pogo. And I think people get carried away too with like this, like, oh, well, it's better for storing energy. And then you're going to release it, like the toes up, saying, oh, well, you're going to really store that energy. And then you're going to release it on the ground. Well, how the hell did anyone ever figure out how to run fast without that being coached? No, the body will figure it out. Like, the body is smart. It will figure it out. How did Bob Hayes run 9.9 in the 100 in 1968 or whatever on a cinder track in lane 1 that someone tore up in the steeplechase without being coached to, lift his toe up for, like, I just think it's so funny. I mean, granted, these are skills athletes can do who are good, but I want athletes just to learn based off their own learning style and just the constraints before I would like have them into doing that. Hopefully they can do it on their own.
Yeah. I really like the rolling through the full foot stuff early on in the plyometrics. I really, really like that. The toes up stuff, I found benefit in coaching that specifically sometimes with athletes who have Achilles issues, and I'm trying to progress them back into plyometric work. And a normal pogo seems to be just flaring them up. And I like getting them to pull their toes up and like almost think about dorsiflexing before they hit the floor. seems to help, but I wonder if that's because it kind of puts them in that stretch position already, and so they're not stretching as much when their foot hits the floor, and so it's actually just taking away, it's almost like a regression of that for them, because they are, when you go and run, like, contrary to popular belief, like, you're going to plantar flex before you hit the floor. It's going to happen. It happens in every single good athlete you've ever seen doing anything athletic. They're not dorsiflex, but the floor, like, effectively is going to dorsiflex the foot for them, isn't it? Or at least that's what I see happening. Yeah. So there. So that, yeah, I was just interested in your take on all of that stuff, because plyometric stuff, it's an interesting one. It's a hard one. There's a lot of, like, very good coaches out there talking about that, like making sure the toes are up dorsiflex before the foot hits the floor. And I think it can be useful, but I try my best not to. That was a selfish question. I've been wondering very much on your thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, I have a couple there. So I will say, and I talk about this in Elastic Essentials, is in context of the whole foot hitting the ground, I do like just having people experience the constraint of simply lifting the toes. So not dorsiflexing the foot intentionally, but you're just lifting the toes off the ground. So you're just not letting the tips of the toes touch the ground. And the way I feel like that constraint changes things is because it just allows athletes to experience only the arches of their foot. Yeah, and maybe their big toe too. Yeah, only the big toe. The big toe too, I guess, is probably touching, but like it really puts them into the midfoot. So now what's my midfoot doing? And I find even as well, I had this experience. I was working with a client. He was just trying to jump higher. We were out in a park somewhere, and I had so many of my ideas come in the middle of a training session. I'm like, oh, like, let's try this. And so it was actually go jump and to the hoop, but you have to like lift your toes up when you do it. And I tried it myself. I was wearing minimal shoes, and I would anyone who's listening to this, just try it next time if you're doing like a box jump or running a jumper at all. Just try doing a jump, lifting just your toes off the ground, and just notice how it changes it. And for me, it helps you to get off the ground way faster, because sometimes the toes can actually be on the ground too long. Like they're just kind of get mushed, and especially if they're kind of like more flaccid, like they're not like have that like gentle hook to them, not gripping, but like a gentle hook. Mm-hmm. Like they can almost mash on the ground too long, and you lose all this tensegrity in the foot. And so just experiencing what it's like to move with the toes off the ground can help you to feel what it's like to be really tied in directly to, I feel like, the elastic system and elastic output. So that kind of probably does sound, maybe it sounds a little bit like I'm contradicting myself, like, but the reason I wouldn't coach full dorsiflexion in the air in context of running is because, and like you said, I do think for some people it could elicit something that could help them, but I wouldn't want to make a habit of it, because dorsiflexion through running. So if I'm running and I'm cognitively thinking dorsiflex, that actually causes me to put on the brakes a little bit in mid stride. It actually is a little bit of a break. And so often if you watch elite sprinters run, and especially ones who haven't been overcoached into it, as the swing leg foot is passing right by the stance leg knee, that foot will usually be in a level of plantar flexion. It's only going to be dorsiflex if they were coached into it. Yeah. And as Adarian Barr talks about, that plantar flexion actually fits with the falling action of running, whereas dorsiflexing intentionally is kind of like this very vertical, rigid, like I'm trying to fight the ground, like that kind of mentality. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think it can offer a key to maybe some greater stiffness, but it also, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul in the grand scheme of things if you're always coaching people to run that way. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Because I think I see that, when you're training a little bit of pronation with someone or something like that, and I actually see some people contract tibialis anterior so hard to pull their knee forward on top of the foot, and they're never going to pronate the foot in that instance, because if the knee needs to come forward, that means hopefully I won't get too complex for people, but the top of the tibia needs to like fall and drop forward, which means the bottom of the tibia almost needs to move backwards relative to that. But if the front of the ankle is tensed really hard, then it's actually trying to pull the distal end of the shin forward as well. So now the knee isn't actually dropping; everything is just being pulled forward. So that's just something that I think about quite a bit. So I think that like overly tensing or trying to dorsiflex can be an issue. But it's interesting that you say about pulling the toes up, but not thinking about dorsiflexing, because like one of my big things in rehab is making sure people have variability through the feet. Like they can get under heel, they can get under midfoot, they can get under forefoot, but getting them on their midfoot like really is a big key to that. But the journey to the midfoot is important. So making sure the heel can move so they can get into the midfoot. But I think that the toes, pulling the toes up for some plyometrics, rather than thinking about dorsiflexion, all it's doing is taking them away from the forefoot and actually giving them their midfoot and tensioning the arches a little bit more and making them use it in that way. So that's actually helped me clear that up a lot more. The toes up versus the dorsiflexion completely. Yeah, that's very helpful. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'll call it midfoot hops. I mean, I'm sure the idea like part of the reason the idea hit me, I'm sure, is some things that you've been said in the past. So I have to credit you for that. But when I jump like that, it's just, it's so different in a great way. And so, yeah, again, I don't want to like be coaching high jump and be like, all right, now remember to keep your toes, like, yeah, you just want to give athletes the experience and then let them do with it what they need to.
I think it's more useful, or not more useful, but more applicable actually in the rehab setting, probably, where you do have a bit more time one-on-one and you are bringing their awareness to certain things. And like that's interesting. That's definitely something that I will I'll have to think more about. Okay, I want to be respectful of your time. I have a few questions about the podcast that I want to ask.
Sure.
So firstly, Joel, like when you hang up from a guest, finish the podcast, you've done the interview, what makes you excited to say, I cannot wait for that episode to be released? Like what do you think is a successful or a really good interview?
That's a good question. So from I guess a selfish point of view, it's I learned something that I'm really excited to put into practice, either with the next client I'm working with, writing a program, my own training. A lot of times, whatever I'm going to do in my next training session. And although that sounds selfish, it's like what comes out, gets outputted into client sessions always starts with something I'm messing around with. And so that's probably just it. Is something that's like, man, I'm so excited about this piece. Like I am really thrilled that I learned that. And so hopefully, I'm excited that other people will too.
Yeah.
I would say that's
do you think that transfers over? Where is there times when, I'm sure there is, but is there times when you finish a podcast and you're like super excited and then that podcast just doesn't do well at all?
Yeah, there have been those. And those actually are times I'm not like, I don't know, like I'm trying to think of some specific examples. I think the biggest ones there are the ones that are more very right-brained, like things that go into like mental training, like a lot of these things that aren't as quantifiable. And therefore, I don't know why, just a lot of people maybe they just aren't ready to be there quite yet. And I think that there is something where a lot of people will say, oh, it's 80% is mental. All the sport is all mental, but then no one does anything about it. I think the same reason that no one does is the same reason those podcasts don't get listened to as much as I would like, but I still will continue to put them out because I find them highly intriguing. But kind of stuff along those lines, that's more in that right brain, more yin atmosphere of things, tends to sometimes not be. Although lately, I feel like some of those have been, so that makes me happy.
Yeah, because the ones that, like, I suppose the ones that people are super interested in listening to are probably the things that they're already good at, and they probably like agree with the person that's talking, and all of these things they've probably heard them talking before, and then maybe it's the other ones they actually need to listen to and will pick up more from. So that's definitely something I will think about. When you think back of your first few episodes or whatever, if you were to listen back, like what mistakes did you make as an interviewer?
I think just I don't think there's anything I could have fixed in the sense like I had to evolve, but I think the big mistakes are just the thing that's evolved is just being nervousness, like, and I still struggle with it in the sense of like being very mechanical, being afraid to just be fully authentic, and I still struggle with that. And even when I'm putting together the pre-roll for the show, like people don't know this about me, but I'll agonize over, did this sound right? Did I introduce the guest and not kiss their ass too much, but also show that it was interesting? Like I really, so still just, I look at like, someone like Joe Rogan who just doesn't, just throws it out there, or people who just throw it out there. They're fully themselves. And that's something I'm still working hard on. And I feel like that is directly linked, I think, to eventually the ultimate success of my podcast. And I think the world just needs that. We're at a time where the world needs just this direct authenticity. I was just, not to derail, I was just finishing a book about Winston Churchill when he was when he was meeting with Franklin Delano Roosevelt right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So this was like massive. The Americans were going to join the war. And like Roosevelt was going through like the hotel, like to go meet with Churchill, and knocks on the door, and like Churchill's in his room, like butt naked, like with a cigar or something. And he's like, it's something, he had his security guy with him, and the security guy, or Churchill's like, well, this is how I am. Like, this is how I am. I have nothing to hide. Like, let's talk. And I just, this rotund, guy who, and I just, that strikes me, because it's like, this is who I am. I have nothing to hide. Let's talk. And I'm trying to embody that more. And that's something that from day one, I think, has been growing.
Yeah, man. I love that. And I think, because whenever I go on a podcast as a guest, I don't want to get the questions beforehand. Some people send questions. Some people send like a vague kind of thing where, here's the topics I'd like to discuss. Either way, I don't really like to read them, because I feel like I'm starting to rehearse my answers in my head then, and it just doesn't feel as authentic. So but that's just me. Now, if I invite a guest on, and some guests, I didn't send you any questions, maybe I should have, but like some guests, I knew we'd be fine because we could just have a chat, but like some guests will probably want a list of questions and very specific topics. And do you think that takes away from an interview, or do you just think that's personal preference?
It's definitely personal. Like, I look at like Christian Thibodeau's like neurotyping stuff, like the type 3s, the people who are very like the endurance runner, the person who's hyper organized. They want the questions ahead a lot of times, and they want to know what, and some of them will even like write out what they think they're going to answer for it, because if nothing else, sometimes more for themselves. And then some people like, don't tell me, I don't want to know. Like Christian Thibodeau himself doesn't even look at the questions if I send them, I don't think, because he just wants to go off the cuff. Like, he wants it to be super organic. So I just think there's just different people out there.
Yeah. How long is an ideal podcast time wise?
Well, for me, editing it or paying someone else to, under an hour. But I don't know. I mean, I think that sometimes to really explore a topic in its its due is anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes. Beyond 90 minutes, it can just get a little, I mean, some topics you can. I like 60 to 90 though, somewhere in there.
Cool. How do you vet your guests? Like, how do you decide who you're getting on?
That's a good question. I was really when I first started this whole thing, it's easy. It's like, who's all the all-stars in the industry? I'm going to talk to all of them, all the people I look up to, all the, and then, like you said, it's been 190 some unique guests, and I don't have people like scouting for me. It's just me looking for different guests. And so, a lot of times at this point, it is repeat guests, but it's almost like you're building a giant tree, in the sense of, okay, here's this school of thought. Here's all these people that were involved in that school of thought. Here's this school of thought. And you get recommendations from different guests on who they would like on. But a lot of it is just, I think it's just me, and I find I'm reading, I'm learning, and I see someone intriguing. And then that's where I think the older that when I started, Joel would have had more hesitancy there. Like, I would have been like, I'm just going to stick with these safe guests, in the sense of everyone knows them, and they're, up to, hey, I'm going to, this person's really interesting. I'm just going to interview them. Let's just see what happens, and you learn so much from that. It's like, you're just slowly painting the picture, this huge picture. And anyways, so it's just poking around and just not being, just being, having that thing to go after the interview and just see what happens.
Yeah. And the thing I'm kind of struggling with when I think about like starting this podcast is, if I listen to your podcast, let's say, and I trust you as a host and as a coach and all of these things, then I'm kind of trusting you to bring on a guest that kind of, at least they know what they're talking about with regards to what they're talking about, right? So my trust of you has been extended onto that guest. So then, if you like, sometimes I might listen to your podcast and a guest is saying something and I'm thinking in my head, I don't know if Joel agrees with what this person is saying based on what I know about Joel. So like, at what stage then do you, like, how do you stay a little bit more neutral or unbiased? And two, do you think you should stay unbiased or neutral, or do you think you should maybe argue a point with someone, or in a respectful way? Or how do you navigate that if you think someone is just saying something that's really just not right? Or, well, I suppose there is no right or wrong, but yeah, how do you navigate that side of things?
Yeah, exploring the context. Actually, that's something I think I've grown into. I should mention that, as I did get some that I at least heard of, never directly, but I'd heard of some criticism that, and I've seen this sometimes in other podcast hosts occasionally, where the guest will say something that's either A, really long and complex, and maybe the host didn't catch it all, which that happens to me sometimes. I try not. These podcasts take so much mental energy out of me, in the sense of, I am by nature a little bit ADHD, and I really hyper focus for these. And then after, like, I can't even type for a few minutes, like my brain is just out of juice. And so I've really tried to try hard to really keep that focus. It's so good for me. Like, this is so good for me. But also, when a guest says something that might be conflicting, and in the beginning, I would just say, awesome, like, that's cool, like, and be hyper agreeable. And then as I've gone on, I realized, no, it's my responsibility too, if I hear something that I don't agree with, to, at the very least, and this is and it has to fit with who you are and your personality. My personality is to be a little more neutral. Like, I'm a Libra, if you're into that kind of thing. So I tried to say, like, for example, I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying this, but I had Michael Zweifel on, an awesome coach from Iowa, a little while ago, and it was one of the best podcasts, in my opinion, that I've had. It was like 275, and at the end, he said something that I don't know if I don't think I entirely agree with it, but it was the idea that it doesn't matter in doing conditioning drills. It doesn't matter if an athlete touches a line or not. All that matters is what happens in the game. And I think there's definitely I agree that it is true. All that really matters is what happens in the game, but I believe there's other possible context to not touching a line in conditioning that fit with the team and the social structure.
Mm-hmm.
And I just said, playing devil's advocate, like, I speak of it more from a place of neutrality, asking questions. And I'm not aggressive with it, but I've definitely learned to, hey, let's explore this more. Like, devil's advocate, what about this? What about that? And so that, I think I've grown in that sense. Yeah. And that's what people want. Like, we live in a day and age where, like, we don't just want what's fed to us. We want to explore. We want people who are authentic, who are able to. And I think that was also my insecurity, and being afraid to ask people questions. And maybe the fact that the podcast is more popular, I feel like I have more. I don't know. I have more ability to do that now. Yeah. But I wish I would have a long time ago. Anyways, that's
my biggest, not fear, like, but that's my biggest thing I've been thinking about, like, because I obviously have different ideas, I suppose, to a lot of people in the industry with regards to movement and stuff like that. And I respect everyone's ideas, and I don't think there's a right or wrong, but I don't want to fall into the trap of being just agreeable with someone just because I'm on the podcast. Because I think there's obviously a lot of coaches listening to your podcast, and probably a lot of young coaches and stuff like that. And a lot of people who, like, critical thinking is a problem in the industry, where someone says something and everyone else just agrees with it, especially if they have a big name or whatever. So I think you have a responsibility, or I have a responsibility, to not just agree with something that I don't agree with, because that might make me feel good at the time, and, like, it keeps the podcast maybe flowing and make my guests feel good. But maybe a lot of people are taking an idea that is not the best idea then. So that's something that I'll probably mess up a lot over the next while, but I'm gonna have to work on it.
Yeah, I think it's all, if we ever had to be a news anchor someday or whatever, or interviewer on a major network, how would that person go about it? Yeah, it's definitely something I'm sure it'll be very natural to you the more you do, for sure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What was I going to ask you? How do I get some big names on? Obviously, I know you, so you can come on. You owe me a podcast. So
I owe you like 5 podcasts,
and I have a few other people that owe me a podcast. But is it just a matter of being consistent with the podcast, and then as the listeners go up, then people are willing to come on? Or is there a secret email you'll send them if you don't know them and you want to get them on?
Yeah. So actually this would be, I've always had good luck. I mean, I find people love to speak their mind and talk. And so often you can get way bigger of a name than you ever thought you could. I think just matter of principle. I have had guests, like the one actually guest that I felt like I really had to work to get. And this was a majorly disappointing one in the sense of, you asked me ones that didn't do as well that I thought were freaking amazing. This show was amazing, and it didn't do real well because I think it wasn't like speed and heavy weightlifting complexes and stuff, but Steven Kotler, like a world expert in flow states. And again, maybe it's more a little bit of the right brain. It's not like something you can take and apply to your athlete in XYZ 1, 2, 3 formats. Anyways, there was an awesome show with Steven, brilliant guy. And but I think I sent them an email, and like I might have sent them a couple, and it took like 6 months. And finally someone, and I don't even know if it was related, said, "Hey, would you like him to be on your show?" And I was like, oh, like I was like celebrating, so excited. And so I think there's just a level of persistence too, and if you really want to have a guest on, I think eventually it'll happen. So yeah, I don't think anything, the way I like to think of it is at some point, I don't think any guest is out of reach if you want them to be on your show enough. So
I'm going to listen to that podcast. I haven't listened to it.
Check it out.
And I don't want to, like, for me, I want to be, this podcast for me is going to be about two things. One is selfish for me, where I want to connect to people and talk with people and hear ideas and stuff like that. And two is, I do have a feeling that I want to like give back to, like, in a weird way, like give back to the industry or help other coaches connect with people that I think have good ideas and listen to people who I think have good ideas. And I think my Instagram like is kind of selfish in a lot of ways, where I do Instagram posts to sell copies of my products and to promote myself and stuff like that. And like that's it. Like I'm trying to give out good information and I'm trying to help people, but like it is a selfish pursuit. Ultimately, I would probably delete my Instagram if I wasn't selling anything. I would probably delete it in the morning if I won the lotto or something like that. So like that's a selfish pursuit, but I don't want the podcast to be that. I want to bring and give people the chance to spread their good ideas, I think. So yeah, and it doesn't necessarily have to just be talking about gym stuff or anything like that. I want to be able to interview different people from different fields, because obviously if you're in any way open-minded, you can learn something about coaching from anyone or any book or a business book or anything. Like there's always lessons to learn from people who have developed a certain amount of excellence in any field, I think. So yeah, I'm going to try and delve into that, even if some of the episodes aren't as popular, let's say. I'm going to try and make sure I have a little spread of topics, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll do great.
We'll see, man. What last question, who's been your best guest, or like maybe your best 3 guests I will give you?
Oh, David Grey.
Apart from me, of course.
Gosh, that's I don't know. It's like you're asking me. It's like I have 2 kids. It's like you're asking me to say which my favorite kid. So I don't know that I can give you an answer there.
I'll ask a better question. So this might be easier. Out of all your guests, let's say you're stranded on a desert island, and you have 1 week you're going to be stranded for, and you can bring 3 guests that you can know, like, okay, I can learn so much from these 3 people for the week. Who would they be?
All right. So actually I'm going to go with 4. Sorry. I'm kind of thinking about
only 3. No, you can have 4. You can have 5 if you want.
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to go with 4 just because I don't know. Yeah. 4 might spread out the learning too much. So, okay. Well, so I'll go with different spectrums of the polarity. So 1, actually, I can do 3. So 1 would be Darian Barr. I haven't seen him in a while, so I'd love to keep learning from him. There's always so much like stuff, so many ideas that would happen with there. Another would be Logan Christopher, who's like herbalist, mentalist, like naturalist, like all these different abilities. Old school strongman. Like, so there's like the inner mental game. So Darian, you have biomechanics. Logan, you have just like that inner mental game. And then Rafe Kelly. I actually spent time with him in Washington, but like parkour and human movement, and more like the the meaning of movement. So the meaning of why we do these things. So there you have a little bit of that element. So I have my three, maybe I'd like to have some more like strength stuff in there. I was thinking of having a strength guest in that four, but I don't have barbells likely or dumbbells so that doesn't matter there anyways. So I'll take those three. That'd be a fun time.
Yeah, man, they sound like, that does sound like a fun time. Definitely. Joel, it's been a pleasure. You're a star. Thank you so much for coming on. Hopefully one of many podcasts that we can do. And hopefully it doesn't crash and burn along the way. Hopefully I'll be figuring out how to actually upload this episode and all those other things along the way that people don't see. So yeah, thanks very much, man. You're a star.
You're welcome. It was an honor to be on and an honor to be guest number one. I can't thank you enough.